Before looking into women's fashion in the 19th century, I think it is important to note that just because these styles were in fashion, it did not mean that that was what every woman wore. Wealth and class had a big impact on what women were able to wear, but even if the lower classes' gowns may not have been as nice as the upper classes, the general shapes of gowns tended to change with what was in fashion. Before I take you through the 19th century fashions, I will start by going through the fashion trends of the later 1700s. The fashion going from the Georgian era and leading into the Victorian era included dresses that held a slender silhouette. This was the time that Jane Austen was working on her Pride and Prejudice, so the film adaptations tried to follow the trends at that time, showing a rise in empire-style gowns. Younger women tended to wear gowns that were more progressive with a high waistline and not too much material, while the older generations of this time were still in dresses made of lots of material and big wigs. What was generally considered to be fashion at this time were waistlines that fell higher than the natural waist of a woman, with skirts that had become narrower and of less material. The style was more vertical, and dresses tended to have elbow-length sleeves that were tighter fitting around the arms and maybe had a bit of pleating and flare around the shoulders. Headpieces tended to be some kind of stylish turban along with ostrich feathers sticking out on top. Overall, the headpieces, wigs, and hair had become smaller than what they were earlier in the 18th century. Corsets were still in use, as the high waistline of these dresses required a high-sitting bust. Powdered hair had died out at this time, and wigs were not seen as much. Light fabrics were in, and trains got longer attached at the back of dresses. The waistline of the dress continued to rise even higher. The bodice of the dress at this time was very short and accentuated the length of the straight skirt. Long trains did not last too long, as they were out again by the end of the decade. Skirts became wider again and gave a trapezoid shape. Puffy short sleeves were in, and there was a demand for fancy fabrics from abroad, such as Indian silks. The hairstyle of this time was lesser compared to the fancy wigs from earlier, but still quite intricate. Women would curl their hair with rags and sweep it into a fancy updo, leaving a few curly pieces out on each side of the front of the face, along with the middle part. After peaking at its highest point, the waistline of gowns dropped again. The 1820s were the transition time between where the waistline fell ridiculously high to where they sat on the natural waistline in the 1830s. Dresses that were highly decorated with patterns and designs were in demand, and the more expensive a dress was, the more decoration it tended to have. The waistline of gowns had finally reached the point where they sat on women's natural waists. Poofy sleeves and the bottoms of dresses were in. Everything began to grow and get bigger nearing the end of the decade. The skirts of dresses began to get shorter as they grew wider. Queen Victoria had a large influence on fashion when she was crowned later on in the decade. She brought a sense of modesty to fashion, which was not something one would normally think a queen would do, especially as another queen that had a huge impact on fashion was Marie Antoinette, who seemed to take the standpoint of bigger is better. Queen Victoria also had a simple hairstyle, with her hair tucked back with the middle part. Queen Victoria would go on to set a trend that is still seen in fashion today with her famous white wedding dress. Although this was not taken well at first, as white was originally the color of gown one would wear while in mourning, Victoria is believed to have started the tradition of the white wedding dress. Earthly colors and tones were seen in women's gowns during the 1840s. The dresses became more fitted in the areas of the bodice and sleeves, but the skirt continued to grow wider. Tight collars started becoming more prevalent in fashions, along with chokers. The hairstyle that was popular during this time was the simple low bun with a middle part, and it would stay until the late 1860s along with minor modifications. The reason that these middle parts were worn by women is said to be because when they were children, men's hair would be parted on the side and women's down the middle to be able to tell them apart, as young children all wore white dresses regardless of gender until they were potty trained. Skirts had become so big at this point that they developed a material to help them not to lose shape or volume. In 1856, crinoline was first patented. These were the modern alternatives to the 18th century hoop skirts and panniers. Skirts now had layers of ruffles as decoration on them, and sleeves got bigger and looser near the hand. For the first time, the waistline actually moved below the natural waist of women. Gowns that were highly patterned with something such as plaid or floral were in. Bonnets were worn throughout the 19th century, but they peaked in this decade. There is an old wives' tale that women who tied their bonnet to the side were of ill reputation or maybe a bit scandalous. There is not much evidence to support that this was an actual standard in the time, however. The constantly moving waistline once again moved back to its natural position. Buttoned bodices became in fashion, taking the place of ruffled skirts. Solid and more plain colors were in, especially with modest patterns along the bottom of the dress, such as various geometric shapes. The overall shape of the skirt began to change as more volume was added to the back to accentuate the lady's back. Big bows also came about at this time. Crinolines had begun to morph into crinolets and eventually bustles. This is also the time when the American Civil War was occurring. During the 1870s, fashion was highly inspired by the 18th century fashions again. Big hair was in and styled to match some of Marie Antoinette's high-standing hairdos. Women would save hair that fell out when brushing it each day until they had enough to make a small ball of hair that could be tucked under their hair to make it fuller and more voluminous. Dresses were highly decorated in frills, flowers, laces, pinks, and pastels. To really accentuate the waist, women began to wear two skirts, one being an underskirt and the other the one to be seen on top. Big bustles, however, began to go away and were replaced by small pads worn on top of undergarments. Skirts began to get narrower again as length and trains were added. Bustles weren't gone for long. They are back alongside spoon corsets, which, going against the idea of small Victorian waists, gave the illusion of a fuller belly. Rather than the back of these gowns going down gradually, bustles gave the shape of a shelf or ledge on a woman's bottom. Frizzy bangs at the front of the lady's face were briefly in fashion. Bustles left again as floral designs were in demand. Sleeves in the gowns got bigger and bigger throughout the decade. Coats, capes, and collars were in at this time, and started to be sewn onto the tops of dresses. There's a bit of a Gothic influence here as chokers and high spike collars are in. The formerly trapezoid-shaped skirts turn more tulip-shaped as fashion approaches the 20th century. The small waist became highly desired as the turn of the century came about. The frizzy bangs left fashion and were replaced by Art Nouveau hairstyles.